Recording in progress. Rick and Juliet.
Are we on? Good evening. Welcome to the May 9th, 2022 regularly scheduled work session. Tonight, there are two items on the agenda. Public comment is allowed that is germane to an agenda item. If you wish to speak, you are required to fill out a public comment card. And if you are speaking on behalf of an organization, you must fill out an affidavit that you have the authority of said organization. Please remember, this is not a time to engage the mayor or members of the city council in conversation. When your name is called, please come forward and speak into the microphone, stating your name and address for the record. Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of the item. Once the item is called, no other public cards will be accepted. Will the city clerk please sound agenda item A?
Thank you, Mayor. That first agenda item is update on proposed landscape improvements along Hopewell Road at the Thomas Byrd Senior House. Our Public Works Director, Ms. Sarah Leaders.
There we go. Good evening, Mayor and Council. So we've got a presentation tonight again on updated improvements for the landscape along Hopewell Road. One of our fiscal 22 budget initiatives was to look at funding and planning for upgrading the landscaping along that frontage of Hopewell Road on the Thomas Byrd Senior Center house property that's located at the intersection of Birmingham and Hopewell. And this is some of these pictures show the existing conditions looking north on Hopewell Road. So I came before you in March at the work session to present plans for the landscape improvements. And tonight got some revisions to those planting plans, and we're seeking feedback on the revisions that we're going to go over tonight. Project goals that were discussed then and currently reflect the latest layout is to stabilize the slope, to beautify the city property, utilize native plantings tied to the existing landscape design, and then look at the future for locations along this frontage for public art. This shows the layout that was discussed again at the March 14th work session. And this layout was really a very, very dense spacing with a lot of perennials as the base for this slope stabilization. There were a few small evergreen shrubs, grasses, and like I said, majority was a lot of the perennials with the coneflowers and black-eyed Susans. So that was the previous plan. Some of the direction that we heard following the work session or during the discussion was to consider larger type shrubs along the frontage that could take up more space, would be less maintenance, to look at the hardiness of plants that could easily spread, as well as strengthen and stabilize the slope, and that could adhere and be planted on a slope like exists there. To try to limit the number of manicured plants that require a lot of maintenance. Some points were brought up that the coneflower and black-eyed Susans, while they bloom for about a month, then you have to go in and maintain and prune those back, and they don't always take right away when they're planted. To look at attractive low maintenance, don't get too busy with the layout, to try to keep it somewhat simplistic, again, to minimize the perennials. That was a recurring theme we heard during the presentation. And then to look for some year-round color in shrubs and to be able to limit the flowers and the more manicured and maintenance-heavy plants. Then another item we discussed at the work session was the signage and the entry at the driveway. We'd initially discussed moving forward with a limited bid scope for just a wall and the plantings at the entry driveway. But another item that was discussed was the signage and looking at upgrading the existing sign and getting everything looking similar. And the main thing that came out of the work session was to rework the planting plan, come up with a different palette and revisit that and target a fall bid for installation. So we initially held up on moving forward with a quick bid for that wall and landscaping, we really wanted to revisit that with looking at the entire planting palette, and as well as how the sign would be attached and mounted. So we haven't moved forward with anything yet, but what we have tonight is a rework of the planting plan that we'd like to get some feedback on. Some of the first things we did was looked at the Hopewell-Hamby roundabout. This was a planting palette from that project. Not all of these plants were utilized out there. The idea was that there would be, there were 4 different alternates that use different combinations of these. But what this illustrates is the color throughout each month, and that some of these shrubs do allow for year-round color in various months and stages. So we took some of these plants, and we'll show you on the following slides some different other ideas for laying out the landscape. So this one, we went back, we moved away from that formal design with the densely spaced plants and went back to the concept for this project. And the image at the bottom is really those pattern areas from the concept, and that's what we want to focus on tonight. So for each of those, some of those pattern areas, we grouped them into some smaller segments to look at, and then proposed a few alternate shrubs to consider in those areas. So this is just one idea of the type of shrubs that could be in each of these kind of planting pattern areas. So they're in the red area, you might look at 2 different shrub types. The azalea, there is a little bit of shade in the back of this red area, and that was one of the plants that was specifically mentioned at the work session as one to consider. You do see a lot of native azaleas throughout the city. And so the azaleas might be in the back of this red planting area, and the front could be like the sunshine ligustrum. For the orange, could do a mix of, again, of some more of that sunshine ligustrum, as well as the mullygrass, the pink mullygrass. There's a lot of that at the roundabout. The yellow areas could be, we heard about the forsythia that was previously on this slope and how nice it looked in the spring, that yellow, and that it had the greenery the rest of the year. So the forsythia mixed with Allura pedalum, possibly in these yellow areas, and maybe some more of the mullygrass. And then the green would tie into the roundabout with the switchgrass and the mullygrass. The blue we'll talk about in a minute on the entry signage. And then 2 other plant types that were called out in that palette that have a little more height to them, not the full, like a tree would, but the butterfly bush and a crepe myrtle could be utilized in these areas for a little more vertical definition to the areas. And then from that, we kind of took it another step further as to what would this frontage look like if it was mimicking like the rural view shed that developments do. So where we have a little more of the vertical definition with some smaller trees, bring in some boulders to create more of a wall. And Tracy Wilds helped lay this out, so give her full credit for this. But we took again some of those planting pattern areas that we saw on the last slide, and really focused in on those a little more. So we'd still have the mix of azaleas and the sunshine ligustrum kind of in what was that red area on the previous slide. Look at a boulder wall to help level that out a little bit, some juniper along the front, and then a possibility for some smaller trees with either a magnolia or a fringe tree, and possibly some red maples. Looked at some groupings of forsythia and mullygrass. So bringing in a lot of those same plants, but kind of taking a different approach with this to look at more like what it would look like as more of a view shed. Then wanted to look at the wall one more time. Previously, we had proposed, let's see, we had the Black-Eyed Susans, the Phlox, and the Distillium. So took another look at that and felt like a daylily would have a little less maintenance than the Black-Eyed Susans would, and they do continually bloom throughout the growing season. So to utilize a daylily in front of the sign, some juniper around the sign, and then the Distillium behind it. There would still be the rock wall proposed, and we'll go over the next slide talks about the sign options. So previously what we had presented was to look at taking the existing sign at the roundabout and creating a similar look at the driveway. The middle picture is the existing sign at the driveway. And there were some comments received that the look of more of possibly a freestanding sign like City Hall might be a better fit here. So what we had originally proposed, again, was utilizing the type of sign that's existing and attaching it to fence, but wanted to get feedback if there's more of an interest in approaching as a freestanding sign like City Hall. We did have some basic cost estimates for the different types of signage. The single-sided sign, like currently out there, is around $3,500, $3,500. The City Hall sign, we're estimating it would be double-sided, but it's at least double in cost as well. And that doesn't include the cedar posts that it's mounted to. So the feedback we're looking for on the signage is, do we want something attached to a fence like we have currently planned out, where we would have some fencing behind it and then it would be attached and double-sided, or do we want to look at more of a freestanding sign at that entryway? And quickly to hit on the budget numbers, we have encumbered a design fee to do this, to do the initial layout that was previously presented. We're looking at redesigning, hopefully just be able to specify different plant materials in-house and put together a bid. The entryway estimate, that's going to be the sign, wall, and some minimal plants around that, is still the $20,000. That's the number that was presented previously. The planting estimate went down substantially. We had estimated $70,000 before for that more dense planting, and then the draft of what we're proposing with more spaced out shrubs and larger plant material is more in the line of a $50,000 estimate. So for the timeline tonight, we wanted to get feedback if we're on the right track with looking at that rural view shed type planting, or if you do want to stick with more of the shrub style, lower growth plant palette that was revised. Then we'd proceed with a redesign, hopefully again using just staff markups and plan revisions to get out the bid and preparing for planting this fall. I'll be glad to go back to any slides or answer any questions.
Real quick, any public comment?
Not on this item.
Okay.
No.
Questions, council?
Looks well done to me. Thank you.
You want feedback on the sign? Is that something like
sign was-
specific you want from us?
Yes.
Okay. Also feedback on the sign?
I think with the cost savings that you've already presented with going with the different planting variations, I think we should invest in the sign that kind of keeps it consistent looking with the Milton sign. I think that's just the look and feel I feel like we're going after. And I don't see that as too much of a cost to upgrade the sign if we have so much cost savings with the planting. If it's within the budget, obviously.
Dan?
Are you looking at two signs, one at the entrance and then one down on, or would you just go to one?
So if we were going to upgrade the look of it, we would do both at the roundabout and then the double-sided at the entrance. So they would look similar. This one is reaching the point where it either needs some maintenance to
No, I
restain it.
just-
So we would look at, upgrading both locations.
I agree with Andrea. I like the idea of going with the Milton City Hall sign. I think it just looks a lot nicer and just adds continuity to what we're trying to do.
I agree. Any other feedback?
I do too. I support Andrew's position, but it's still not clear to me. I know, is it possible that with the upgraded sign being two-sided and the proper placement of that we wouldn't necessarily have to do the second sign?
That's right, we could. Yes, we could take out the one at the,
I'm not sure
Roundabout.
if it's properly placed and it's going to be prominent and it creates a sense of continuity from City Hall signs to that too. To then still introduce another look might be overkill. I would think that if we took a hard look at the right placement of the sign, and maybe it is just in the primary place that you've noted, that would be sufficient.
Sarah, could you pull up the planning map and maybe we can see where those two signs are going to be or proposed?
so the current proposed wall would be closer to the driveway. The existing sign might be a little further down the slope,
I don't
but
think I'm.
we'd be doing the double-sided
We're
here
not
so you could see it.
Yeah, we're not seeing
We're not seeing anything.
Sorry.
There we go. Okay. There we go.
Okay.
Okay, so here's the entrance, driveway entrance way.
Mhm.
This is the proposed wall, so the sign would sit behind the wall,
That's where the upgraded,
freestanding.
in keeping with
Yes.
the city sign would go?
Yes, yes.
So is it necessary that it be two-sided if
Yeah,
it's
that's what
there?
I'm wondering.
So it would face similar to,
Oh.
but this one is actually double-sided, I believe. So you would see it coming from both directions, but if
Okay.
again, currently, if you're seeing the one at the roundabout, and then this was just more to note that the driveway is just to the,
So you would do it
to the s-
perpendicular to the road then?
yes.
Except you'd have to look at do a visual study to make sure you're not hindering exiting the parking lot if it's going to be perpendicular
Right.
to the road.
But where would the other one be? At the roundabout? I mean, at the,
Down.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But we
right
could
over there.
install one and hold off on the one on the fence and see whether it's overkill or not.
That's a good idea.
Going that way. Coming on the road, okay.
are y'all
Yeah.
good with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And then the design option with the trees, you'll like,
I
That
really like
approach-
the
Looks
rural,
great.
I really like the rural design option. The one with the
Mhm.
trees, I think that looks really sharp.
You know,
Is that everything you need from us?
I think so.
Good.
Yep.
All right,
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thanks, Sarah.
Hey, Tammy, will you please see on agenda item B?
Mayor, that item is overview, discussion, and solicitation of council feedback regarding agricultural exemptions as referenced in state law and in Milton's code. Our city attorney, Mr. Ken Gerard.
Trails.
Use Ken, where are you going to stand?
All right, so members of the council, let me try this, and I don't know that I've ever shown a PowerPoint here before in Milton.
Growth
I don't have
opportunity.
any of the pretty pictures, though, that Sarah just had. So this evening, I'm going to be walking through you with a lot of state law and a lot of Milton codes. Because city manager and I and other members of staff have been dealing with the issue of agricultural exemptions to various aspects of our code for years. And this is an area where I believe that the government, Milton, has the ability to make policy decisions or preferences in how these matters are interpreted. And that would help me work with your staff, planning staff, and Steve to figure out how aggressive or how relaxed, and there's not a right or wrong answer. So any language I use that you feel is charged is not supposed to be that way. This is simply me trying to figure out what the vision, how hard you want us to press on some of these issues, and give us some guidance, because I think the ultimate result of this may be a recommendation to your city manager that we tweak some of these codes to give us some finality. But I know I speak with some authority in saying that we do need some definitiveness on this. It is time for every time we get an agricultural exemption use or an issue to not be having to make this up from whole cloth again. We need to know what the council is looking for. Sort of with that in mind, let me tell you what the issue is. Okay, let me tell you why this is a little bit of a conundrum for us. So, what do I have to point at? Oh, I need to turn it on. That's it. All right. So first of all, we're going to start with state law. All right. We're going to start with some state statutes. OCGA 216. This one you hear a lot. In other words, typically when we get perhaps a communication from a citizen in Milton that says, you can't regulate me, you can't touch me, a lot of times it's going to be in reference to OCGA section 216. And it is a very general, it's not even tethered to a specific statutory paradigm. It is simply sort of a statement. And it says this: no city, municipality, shall adopt or enforce any ordinance, rule, regulation, or resolution regulating crop management, or animal husbandry practices. That's not all. The definition continues: involved in the production of agricultural or farm products on private property. So a couple of things just to go ahead and get them out of the way. First of all, there's no case authority interpreting this. In other words, it's not been litigated what this means before, and a court has sort of come out and said, this is what it means, this is how you apply it. Nothing. So that right there bakes in the ability of you as the policymakers to determine what this looks like. Now, not surprisingly, you'll then see subparagraph B below it, and subparagraph B below it says, oh, by the way, this doesn't affect a local government's ability to regulate these issues by way of zoning. And why is that true? Because zoning is a creature of the Georgia Constitution, uniquely vesting that power into city and county government. So the General Assembly doesn't have the right to tell you what to do in the context of zoning, which is why we take the argument that local governments get to regulate short-term rentals. Local governments get to regulate build-to-design subdivisions, not the General Assembly. So this is an interesting piece of legislation. On the one hand, it says, don't get involved in crop management or animal husbandry on private property, but oh, by the way, your zoning power remains inviolate. What do I look at this and see? Number one, just as a student of sort of the law, I see a general expression of public policy of the So clearly, the General Assembly means to tell us something by this. What is it? I think, and I'm going to go ahead and forecast where I'm going to end. I think we need to be thinking about the context of, is this talking about agricultural uses, husbandry, crop management, that are of commercial origin? In other words, does this need to be a commercial agricultural exercise that this is attempting to get us out of the way of? Or could this be a simply non-commercial private garden in somebody's private property? So I'm not going to answer that question yet, but I want you to be thinking, because right there, that would be another way of interpreting this. In other words, could the city of Milton say that within the context of this sort of agricultural exemption, we're thinking that means a commercial farm, a commercial agricultural use, commercial crops? Or it doesn't mean commercial. It simply means any agricultural use. So I'm not asking you to answer that, and I'm not going to answer it for you yet. but I want you to at least be thinking. Those are the sorts of inflection points that we as staff and the city attorney, we need you to give us some guidance on, because I could make a really good argument either way. Okay, let's keep going. So that's one. That is a general statement of sort of state law on this exemption, that we're not supposed to get in the way of animal husbandry practices or crop management. All right. This is another huge expression of state law, and this is talking about land disturbing activity, right? Land disturbing activity, this is obviously a general law having statewide application, but this statute is terribly important because what state law contemplates is the General Assembly has adopted these rules that says basically, look, if anybody in the state takes action to disturb soil such that you can either allow the soil to now be washed off the site and into the waters of the state, or that it can be blown off the site into someone else's property, well, that's land disturbing activity, and we need to regulate that because that undermines our rivers, our creeks, etc. It's not surprising that it's referred to as sort of soil and sedimentation, because the more we have soil and sedimentation leaching off of property, going into our creeks, going into our waterways, those are pollutants. All right, and so we have federal laws that regulate that. We have state laws that regulate this. And this is the basis, this statute, OCGA 1273, that is the basis upon which the city of Milton has its own version of this. And in fact, state law contemplates that. State law basically says, here is our soil and sedimentation minimum standards, and you, local governments throughout the state, you are empowered to adopt your own variation of this. And you have to be at least as strict as this, and if you do, then we will actually make you an issuing authority such that you can now at the local level issue land disturbance permits. And so Milton has done that, as have all of the metro jurisdictions done that, and which is why the city of Milton is able to issue land disturbance permits. And otherwise we regulate this soil and sedimentation activity. Why? Because the state of Georgia tells us to, and B, because it contains a lot of environmental protection. That's the way we make sure that our waterways and our streams just don't get right. So interestingly, under subparagraph 9, you see that extremely broad definition of land disturbing activity, any activity which results in soil erosion from water or wind. There at the very end, consistent with that policy of Georgia we just looked at, there's an exemption, and the exemption is agricultural practices as defined in a later code section. So this is kind of an exercise in statutory construction as well. So now we have this tremendous grant of regulatory authority to help against unmitigated soil and sedimentation erosion. But then there's a large exception. It says, oh, by the way, this doesn't apply to agricultural activities or practices. So let's keep thinking about that. So once again, another expression of public policy by the General Assembly. A couple things to think about as well. And this is again, just me helping you think about this. If you agree, as I do, that this statute is aimed at environmental protection, which I think is a large aspect of why this is there, should any exemption dealing with environmental protection be broadly construed or narrowly construed? I'm not going to answer it yet. I'm just sort of teeing you up for the thought process that you all are going to have to go through. But that's something we need to think about as well, because that is a huge exemption to say that agricultural uses are exempt from something that is otherwise designed to protect the environment. Keep going. Only 78 slides left. All right. Continuing forward. Best management practices, OCGA 1276. I think I've already sort of mentioned this. If you look down in subparagraph B, you'll see some bold language there. What that is basically saying is the state of Georgia is telling local governments that you need to adopt a soil and sedimentation code, and it must be at a minimum as stringent as the state general requirements. Now, When I first read that, I was thinking, well, if agricultural uses are an exemption and we have to structure our code to make it just as rigid or stronger, then couldn't we just pull out an exemption altogether? Because if you pull out an exemption, haven't you made the code stronger? Right? I mean, that would be the argument. If you pull out an exemption, you've made it tougher. Georgia doesn't allow that. The exemptions are inviolate. So because there's an agricultural exemption, the Attorney General, hope I have this, yes, the Attorney General has opined, it's old, it's 1987, but I believe it continues to be very persuasive authority. And what the Attorney General says is that exemption for agricultural practices, we can't overcome that. In other words, we can't decide that we're not going to apply the agricultural exemption. We do, in fact, have to honor it. Okay, so that sews up that. If I was going to tell you that we can just make our code really strong and forget about agricultural exemptions, everybody's regulated, at least the Attorney General would say that's not true. You've got to honor those agricultural exemptions. There's a method to my madness, I promise. Let me see. Okay. 12.7.4. And again, you see me camping out here in this OCGA 12.7, 2, 3, 4, and 5 language. A lot of text there. I don't need you to read it all. But what I do want you to see is this. In the middle of that paragraph, I hope you can see in the middle toward the right side, it's in bold and it says, where the local governing authority. Everybody see that where I begin to read that?
Yep.
Okay, this is interesting. So here within this land disturbing activity statute, the General Assembly added this language, where the local government, you're the local government, deem it appropriate. Okay, well, that's an exercise in discretion. They're giving you discretion. Where you, in your enlightened wisdom, deem it appropriate, you may integrate these land disturbing prohibitions in with other local ordinances relating to land development, because we have a lot of codes that relate to land development. And this is interesting, and it even calls some out, including you could wrap in some soil and sedimentation protection measures into your tree protection code, floodplain protection code, your stream buffer code, or your stormwater management code. Interestingly, Milton has codes on every one of those topics. Fascinating. But we've not done that. We've not provided an integrated codification of those. But then the statute then says something else. You can integrate these, but then it says further bold, but irrespective of whether they're integrated. So see where it says whether or not the ordinances are integrated? Irrespective of whether they're integrated, the last bold, except as otherwise provided by Code Section 12.7.17. The way I read that is attempting to tell me that even if you integrate your soil and sedimentation code along with your flood protection code and your stream buffer code and your stormwater code, you still have to honor the agricultural exemptions in the land disturbance code. Kind of an epiphany to me. That's a big deal. That means almost this statute is reaching out to some of our other codes and saying the agricultural exemption still applies. That's powerful. So I want you just to keep that in mind as well. This is really sort of covering the waterfront with all of the ways the General Assembly is attempting to make sure that we rightly account for bona fide agricultural activities. So let's keep going. I'm not going to read that. We've already talked about it. Okay, so here is the key. All of this has been leading up to this definition right here, OCGA 12.7.7. No land disturbing activities, again, think soil and sedimentation, but I could go further. I could go floodplain, stream buffer, stormwater. No land disturbing activities shall be conducted in this estate except those land disturbing activities provided for in Code Section 12.7.17. All right. 12.7.17 contains a series of exemptions. 5 is the one we're going to focus on. It should be at the bottom of what you're looking at. That's the agricultural operations. But I put in 3 because I'm attempting to give you the full story, because you're going to have to make some decisions or at least give us some guidance. And I put in 3 because what I'm trying to show you is I don't think that agricultural operations necessarily means every time somebody plants something on their property. And here's why I'm saying that, because 3 says, first of all, it's trying to be very utilitarian. It said, look, if you commence land disturbing activity, we're going to require local governments to impose these what's called best management practices to make sure that the dirt generated by the land disturbing activity is not going everywhere and causing environmental damage. But we also know that there are minor land disturbing activities that we really don't want an oppressive government to have to force people to get permitting before they do anything. And so what would those sort of minor land disturbing activities look like? Well, we're going to give y'all some grace and not have to get permitted. How about this? Home gardens. Now that's interesting because I could make an argument that a home garden is in the context of a crop or an agricultural purpose, but that's not the way the statute's treating it. The statute's treating it as home garden as something a little different. And of course, individual landscaping, for heaven's sakes, we don't want people that want to plant a bunch of petunias to have to come in and get a land disturbance permit, right? That might not end well for us. Repairs, maintenance work, fences, and other activities which result in minor soil erosion. The purpose of 3 is not to give you a holistic example of every possible minor land disturbing activity. It's simply intended to be illustrative. These are the kinds of things that the state of Georgia, and by extension, the city of Milton, have no public policy interest in trying to regulate. Our citizens can plant a garden without getting permission. But then 5. Okay, 3 was just an example to let you see an example. 5 is the exemption that is so terribly powerful because it implicates everything. It implicates land disturbance, soil and sedimentation, floodplain, stream buffer, stormwater, tree ordinance, etc. So what does it say? It says you don't need a LDP, at least under the state law, for agricultural operations as defined in code section 133. You got to be kidding me. So they take a definition and refer to another definition and then provide, in addition to that definition, additional language within it. So only the General Assembly can draft this way. Agricultural operations as defined in code section 133 to include those practices involving establishment, cultivation, or harvesting of products. Anybody beginning to think why the commercial aspect of this could at least be in my head a little bit when I read the cultivation or harvesting of products, the preparation and planting of pasture land, farm ponds, dairy operations, livestock and poultry management practices, and the construction of farms. This language is consistent with general public policy of the state of Georgia that we want to give bona fide agricultural operations some grace from having to deal with the government every time they want to take action that is a bona fide agricultural use. The question I'm putting in front of you, though, again, not to answer it yet, though, is I think this is talking about commercial agricultural operations or is it talking about non-commercial operations? Remember, going back, the statute not only had its own definition of agricultural operations, but then it punted to OCGA 133. OCGA 133 is at the very beginning of the Georgia code books, and it is this glossary of all these defined terms in Georgia law. And sure enough, 133 defines agricultural operations, and agricultural or farm products synonymously. They are interchangeable terms and concepts. And they mean, I'm not going to read it for you. You can read it. They're really just the first couple lines there: raising, harvesting, crops, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very broad definition. I'm not going to take that back. It is a broad definition, and I think that a person reading this could reasonably conclude that it included non-commercial agricultural operations.
So, Counselor,
Yes.
are you equating agriculture with commercial?
No, that's fair. I'm doing the best I can to interpret the definition in a way that makes sense. Things like production of livestock. Let me give you another example, Councilmember Cookley, and it's a fair question, and it's the question I want you all to think about. because I don't think it's fair to say agricultural is synonymous with commercial. But when I look at production of crops, and by the way, do you see that in the second line there, crops is bolded? That was on purpose. I did that because later there in 133, there's a definition of crops and includes other agricultural products that are produced for sale. That to me was another clue that perhaps what the General Assembly is talking about is in fact commercial farming operations. They ask, okay, Ken, well, okay, production, non-commercial, you're still producing crops. That would be fair. But I'm also trying to think is what is the state of Georgia's public policy rationale for wanting to regulate this at all? Does the state of Georgia really care to exempt non-commercial agricultural uses, or is really what the state of Georgia is attempting to do here is shore up our commercial agricultural industry in this state? And that's why they're trying to tell local governments, if it's a commercial farm operation, you guys need to stay out of it and let our agricultural partners be able to prosper and not be subject to extensive regulation. I'm not saying that wins the day either. And I know you're looking at me going, Ken, could you answer one question definitively for us? I'm trying to not answer it specifically because I'm looking for guidance, because there could be really good arguments either way on this. But how you all ultimately give us guidance on how you want it interpreted will mean a lot on what I recommend to Steve with respect to modifications to it.
Well, if you can't define commercial,
Yep.
then you can't take the riddle backwards. For example, if you have a 10-acre tract of land
Yep.
and you're selling 4 jars of honey because you've got 5 beehives, is that commercial?
That is, if you're selling it to third parties, I would argue that is commercial.
If Councilmember Johnson or I sell a horse for a lot of money, yet we grow no hay, we don't grow anything, we don't foal anything, but we just sell a horse for a lot of money, is that commercial?
You know, it's interesting. I think at some point we have to look to, I think in classifying the use of property, and I know planners do this all the time, they'll look at the primary use of the property versus the ancillary use, determine how we're going to categorize that property. I have a house. My 12-year-old or 8-year-old used to do a lemonade stand at the front of it. So for at least a little bit of time, she was attempting to sell lemonade. That doesn't change the primary purpose of the yard. Is still a residential purpose. And I'm making a silly example, but you get the idea. At some point, I do think governments have to take the position of what is actually occurring on the property as its primary use in the property.
Okay, so, all right, but look, we can't solve this riddle at the macro level because we don't have those kinds of properties that are big cattle, commercial cattle properties, et cetera.
Yes.
But what we can do is look at it in the sense of the hobby farms, most likely the equestrian facilities that we have, right?
That's exactly the
Okay.
discussion we need to have.
So what are we doing? Are we actually then narrowing down to a very fine point where some people are ticking us off because they're maxing the lots and disturbing the land? Is that what this exercise is about?
Ken, really quick, can we go to public comment first
Before we actually.
and then we'll get into it? Is that okay?
Absolutely. I mean,
I just want to make sure we do public comment
Does he-
and then we can,
does he follow
are you done
along?
with your presentation?
no, but that's cool. We can.
Okay, well then y'all can go back and forth.
No, I was on a roll.
Okay.
And I'm going to
I know.
stop and get a
Okay.
Tootsie Roll.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
That's all right.
Let me go ahead and just finish it
Okay,
up, and
okay.
then we'll come back, because
Well,
really,
I'm going to hold because I.
this
I
is
think we should
exactly
get
the
that.
discussion we need to have.
Exactly,
Is
yeah.
this
Well, I think
discussion.
you're going to have a more intelligent one in a minute, so.
Okay.
Talking to me.
All right, so
Not you.
continuing forward, I just want to emphasize this to you, again, just to help in your deliberation process, 12/7/18. So remember, this is still in the state law, talking about these agricultural exemptions with respect to land disturbance activity. And then the General Assembly, just to make it even a little tougher, says, oh, by the way, no provision of this chapter authorizes any person to violate the state law on water quality control. So again, you know, am I suggesting that the statute's a little bit schizophrenic? I'm not. I'm simply suggesting to you, though, clear expression of the public policy in Georgia is we want to make sure our streams and our land are not degraded environmentally. Then we want to exempt bona fide agricultural property from that environmental regulation. And then we want to remind you, by the way, that we're still not going to allow anybody to mess up and degrade the quality of our water. So those are the sorts of public policy rationales you all, us, collectively sort of need to walk through, because they inform us. They inform us of what this is supposed to be doing. Continuing, state law takeaways. State law has a catch-all exempting crop management and animal husbandry practices from non-zoning regulations. Under state law, land disturbance activity does not include agricultural practices as defined. Our city code must be as restrictive as state law. It may not include practices that are exempt. Remember, I told you that. The Attorney General says, no, you got to honor that agricultural exemption. Local governments may incorporate land disturbance restrictions into other codes like tree protection, floodplain protection, etc., but the agricultural exemptions still apply. Agricultural exemptions is likely referencing commercial operations, but I could be persuaded and could make good arguments otherwise, truly. OCGA 12717 exempts home gardens as an example of a minor land disturbing activity, but it's not the home garden. It's the function that it's a minor disturbance. That's the key. It's simply an example. And since the agricultural operation exemption could include uses that have a major impact on soil and sedimentation, should those exemptions So here's some of my questions, and maybe, Mr. Mayor, the time to have this debate is after this slide. I think it's a natural sort of point inflection. Should the city of Milton apply the agricultural operation exemption narrowly or broadly? Depending on Milton's construction, that will then control how the same exemption is interpreted throughout city codes to include floodplain, stormwater management, tree protection, et cetera. Factors in favor of agricultural operations being only commercial, the various definitions of agricultural products, the fact that the home gardens are defined separately. I'm asking, this is me asking, so I mean it's sort of rhetorical, but still for us to think about, what public policy interest would the state of Georgia have in regulating non-commercial agriculture? Or, given that these are exemptions to disturbances that otherwise cause pollution, it would seem that an exemption should be construed no more liberally than the statute. 5, state law declares that exemptions notwithstanding, there is no license to violate pertinent clean. So a lot to bite off, and I know this is a little bit of an exercise in statutory construction, which is not terribly helpful. But I will tell you this. We get this question all the time. Applicants will come to the city. We have had LDPs not applied for at all, with individuals saying, we're not covered, it's an agricultural use. Now, we have baked into our code basically an advanced look language where we have asked people that if you're about to come in and do something you think is agricultural, why don't you come tell us first, and we'll evaluate whether we think it's agricultural, and then nobody's going to be confused. You can go out and do your work. We won't mess with you. But if we disagree, we're going to require you to be permitted. But again, that's a process. That's not the answer. The answer still rests with how you want us to look at this and how you want us to interpret this. And I don't mean to make it simple, but I'm thinking broad or narrow. And within those contexts, we need to just...
Well, if you go narrow, you can't have a conversation.
It's a much more limited conversation. I agree. If it's narrow, in other words, if it's narrow, which means that it would only apply to, so let's say, commercial, right? Is that
Well,
what
we
you...
haven't defined that,
Right, exactly.
so we
And-
can't.
Well, we could, but it would, but again, is it that the primary purpose of the property is commercial, or there just happens to be a little bit of commercial activity on the property from time to time? In that case, I would say the primary use of this property is a private, nonprofit agricultural operation, and it's not commercial. I know commercial when I see it, but defining it statutorily, Councilmember Cookerly, is a little.
I'm going to say, it could take a lot of work to get those 4 jars of honey.
And remember, our zoning's agricultural zoning.
Correct, and that makes Milton
Make sure we're
uniquely
clear on that.
vested in this because so much of our property is agricultural, which makes, but unfortunately, there are citizens, I think, in the city of Milton who think that because they're doing work on agricultural property, it's necessarily agricultural because of that, and that's not true.
Correct.
You can certainly do non-agricultural activities on agricultural property.
Amy, ready for public comment?
We do. Are you ready?
Yep.
Call
I'd
our
like to
first
invite Mr.
witness.
Scott Reese to the podium.
Mayor and Council, I'm Scott Reese, Brumlow Reese and Associates, doing business at 13685 Highway 9, Milton, Georgia, 30004. Before I kind of get into the more of the body, like to kind of work on or trying to define a couple of things that I got out of the presentation. So on the primary use of a property as agricultural or residential, I think is what we were hinting around at. No one that I know of is trying to exempt the standard residential permitting in these processes. So everyone that passes through my office leaves there with the full knowledge that the home construction, anything to do with that if it's not, so if you bought 12 acres, you're going to build a house, plus you're going to do 8 acres of horse farm. I tell them the 8 acres of horse farm is exempt. The house construction and everything associated with that is not. I may be wrong. Your opinion and I probably differs, but it is opinions. So, and also I think the reason the home garden was put in there was we need a category for someone who is doing a agricultural use, but they're not selling a product. Did it define, is that home garden 2 acres, 5 acres, 10 by 10? Obviously, they made that very broad to keep government overreach into this very thing, in my opinion. Once again, it's maybe wrong. So, long history. City of Milton when it was Milton County. My father may be the last Milton County, 92 years old. So, short little statement. We owned the farm I grew up on, Birmingham Highway to Wood Road. Little subdivision called White Columns with a golf course. Fuji decided they were going to purchase this piece of property and develop it. Lo and behold, we had a storm. The Reese family cows decided they were going to cross over the fence where the tree blew down. And I think at that time there were maybe 120 in that herd. They went through White Columns. My dad got a summons. So they had ruined sodded lawns and other. So he was, son, I can't handle this. We're going to have to sell. So in that particular place, family farm that we'd had since 1835, we had to sell. Because even though I don't mind a fight, at that point in time, he was not going to, and he was not going to spend everything. So I have a little bit of emotion involved in this, where I feel government overreach. Someone buys, a tiny lot. So one of the people or families that asked me to speak, their property is for sale now, 170 acres up off Day Road. When I was talking with them, they said, Scott, you do not realize how many variances have came through for the surrounding subdivisions. And we only know of one that was denied. I have to go out every 5 years and do a perimeter search and send letters to the individual 1 acre lots where they built fences and encroached over onto. And they're tired. They can't cut a tree if it falls on the fence without a neighbor calling and complaining because they didn't get a permit. I say they have an agricultural exemption. Members of you that live in the subdivisions probably say they don't. And, I'm going to disagree. So how do you define a commercial agricultural practice? Is it the volume of the sale, or is it purely the product produced? There. I cut the hay for the squirrels right down the road here as a favor to them. In your list, it will have the production of grass or crops for the raising of livestock or the feeding of livestock, I think is the technical term. No money changes hands. I say it is a bona fide agricultural practice. It's not a commercial. It is not a 10,000 acre Kansas cattle farm. So I think you're really headed down a slippery slope if you try to narrowly define it. As I know you've heard me say many times, what differentiates Milton from Alpharetta, Johns Creek, Roswell, all the other, Platinum Ghetto of North Metro Atlanta is the agricultural properties that have left here. And anything you can do to preserve those, I think would be a giant step forward to maintain the quality of life and the uniqueness of this area. So, and my discussions with staff in the past, I would be proactive and I would create a booklet or a pamphlet that would list the best management practices for soil and erosion control in the state of Georgia. When someone comes in and, I don't have a problem with the, hey, if they come through my office, I'm going to create 10 acres of pasture. I'm going to remove the trees. Let the city know. To me, if you're clearing that for your horses or if your child's going to do a 4-H lamb project, whatever, I don't care. To me, you're getting really into the weeds to define that. Now, if you build the house, everything else, you're going to have to get permitted standardly. But the city, in my humble opinion, would be much better off trying to be proactive and citizen-friendly on creating this guideline and reinforce that you can do this, but be aware that you will not be exempt from letting or polluting state waters. So hopefully you can reinforce the fact that, guys, put silt fence up, get this grassed as soon as you possibly can. But right now, we do not have separate LDP projects. So any land disturbing activity in the state of Georgia that the area of disturbance is greater than 1 acre or within 200 feet of state waters requires a special NPDES permit, 3-phase erosion control, where cost is anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000. It requires temporary sediment basins, hydrology studies, all of these things that if you're building a Walmart, absolutely. But if you're taking down trees and immediately converting it over to pasture, that's great overkill. So right now, if you're saying, well, it's not an agricultural practice, it is a standard LDP, there is no middle ground or 20% ground. It's all the way over here. You don't have separate LDP packages. So I think that you really need to think through this. There is no way that I can guarantee you're ever going to have a bad actor. And I know I hear constantly, well, somebody's going to buy this land and they're going to rape it and pillage it, and then under the agricultural exemption, and then they're going to build a subdivision. When they build that subdivision, what they're going to do? They're going to spend a fortune in meeting the regs for the subdivision that are excluded from the ag exemption. So they're going to have to replant trees. The cost alone of removing the trees and grading, you can be up to $10,000 an acre, and that economics are grammatically incorrect. That thesis doesn't work. it maybe worked when Milton was $3,000 an acre. It doesn't work when it's 100 to 120 to 170. So that fear mongering is nothing but fear mongering. So think it through. There are probably not going to be any more dairy farms, any more Reese cattle farms. There are going to be, hopefully, a lot of people that want 10-acre hobby farms. And I'm sorry, I'm going to make some people mad. If you're on your half-acre or 1-acre subdivision lot, you may have to put up with a little bit of that unhappiness for 2 months or 3 months, or the fact that I only wanted to drive by those trees. Well, some of your rights stop at your property line. And I know that's not going to be, I'm not winning a lot of friends with that, but sorry. If you're in that, it's like someone was talking to me the other day about, oh, I love trees. I love trees. I said, wow, how many acres of trees do you have? Well, I don't. Well, my family owns about 200 acres of nothing but trees along with our farm. So I think really, truly, a person that is legitimately buying a large tract of land for a hobby farm, it's through a love of the land or something to do with the last thing they're looking to do is to ravage and pillage that piece of property. So I would think they are probably the number one best stewards of that property. So I think whether Mr. Gerard's, I think, definition was liberal or extreme as far as that. I think you really need to be thinking about the liberal with safeguards. And I think with our competent staff, we can come up with, you come in here, you tell us you're going to do this. Okay, we're not going to run you off. We're not sending you to Cherokee County where we can, put this property into the next 1-acre lot subdivision. But here are some guidelines. Here are some things that you should work with. If you do it in the winter, you need to plant ryegrass, rye, wheat, triticale. You're doing the summer, heat of the summer, you need to put millet and Bermuda down. Or there are things that the city could do that would help some of these. A lot of them that come through are pretty green. They don't know best management practices. But I think city staff could work, or the city as a whole, to educate them, and an ounce of prevention may be worth a pound of cure. So that's what, but there are some very important pieces of property that if this goes wrong, they're ready to sell. Because if they cannot use their 170 acres or their 90 acres or their 40 acres or 20, if it's going to be regulated by the government, every time I go, so maybe Mr. Gerard can define the family garden, the size limits. I didn't see any. So if one of our, citizens decides to put a pumpkin patch or a corn maze on his property, he plows 1.5 acres, but he's really not selling an agricultural product. Are we looking to then require him to get a building or a LDP for each of those things? So I wish, or I hope that you will give it a true thought and try to look at both sides on this and think that if a really heavy-handed approach on this will, with the no threat, no anything in there, but if you really don't think that a developer is not looking to purchase everything available in this city, I'm sorry, you're sadly mistaken. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
No, there's
Okay.
none.
Hey, real quick, Steve, can you give council kind of a history of some examples that we've had in the past and some in the recent that we've had to address? And kind of why we're sitting here?
Can I talk about them in
Yeah.
generalities?
Absolutely. Sure.
So this goes back, I think, back to 2017, where we had a horse farm within the city that was doing a significant amount of land disturbance, acres and acres of land disturbances. They were raising the level of their pastures. We ended up having a significant amount of erosion coming off of there into the neighborhood behind it. And we found out the hard way that we had no right to regulate that after we had to go back and take back the summonses that we wrote in violation of our ordinances, which we really had no right to enforce. It was an agricultural exemption. It was considered a bona fide agricultural use. And we were working with Ken's office at the time. We took back those tickets. The state did hopefully what the state did, and I think the neighboring community ended up suing the farm. We've had, since then, we've had some others in different areas of the city. There was one 10-acre.
Steve, just to finish that one though, because
Sued them for what?
the neighboring community sued the landowner successfully.
I don't know the outcome.
I happen to
You
know
do.
the outcome of that. They sued successfully, and the landowner was required to mitigate the runoff that was causing the problem for the pond. So in that case, state water protection prevailed, I believe. And that's why the neighborhood was able, because the neighborhood was facing a significant cost to dredge the pond because it was causing, it was intended to be also their water mitigation, water management for the neighborhood.
Correct.
So-
And like Ken said, you can't, regardless if you're agriculturally exempt, you can't violate the Clean Water Act.
Right.
Nor can you create a nuisance. I mean, you can't
Right.
create a nuisance on a downstream property by just dumping a lot of water on it, irrespective of this exemption in state
Right.
law. You still have to.
Okay, so why couldn't the city follow through with that summons and deal with the water issue? Why did it take the private side to do that and the city had to retract?
Because the city does not have the authority to regulate agriculturally exempt, bona fide agricultural uses, and which this was. The state does. And what the state does is they go in and they enforce the Clean Water Act. They can turn around
The
and
state could have done that.
they can, they may have. We did get the state involved, but
Okay,
our
I
hands
get
were
it.
off at that point. But that doesn't prevent the homeowners from taking some type of private action for trespass, which is what I assume occurred. We've had a bunch of others. We've had others that had no impact on neighboring properties, to my knowledge. We had 10 acres cleared in another part of the city, ended up turning into a very nice pasture, and I think people generally enjoy the look of what that has turned into. And then of recent, we've had some potentially problematic ones where the neighbors were concerned when trees came down. I think we had some in one of them, we had some sedimentation that was getting off the property and into the neighboring properties. And it was claimed under an agricultural exemption. But what it comes down to from a staff perspective, and to kind of reiterate what Ken is getting at, there's policy decisions to be made because it's not a bright line determination. It's not just a binary decision. It depends on how the council wants us to enforce, what approach you want us to take, how liberal or how strict. And then we can now turn around and we could draft the appropriate ordinances to be able to support that. But right now, there's an absence of those things. They don't really exist. We mention agricultural exemptions, but we don't really define what they are. And what we're hoping for from today, and maybe subsequent conversations if necessary, is to get an idea from a policy standpoint, where does this council sit? So we can start drafting those ordinances and maybe reducing some of the frustration, not only for the people that are coming in for the agricultural exemptions, but from the neighbors who think that we're not acting the way we should be when dealing with these problems.
Well, sorry, just in response to that. So I personally, this is what I would need to be involved in this, okay? I can't become an expert on this code. I'm not going to retain it, all right? I can't fathom what staff goes through. I don't live in their shoes. But if you want me to go through a liberal side and a more general side, I would need to see problem, potential solution, and I would need to see those categorically all the way across, and then I can sort of check, and give you some feedback. But I don't know how else I can go through this and go liberal or broad when we can't even define what is commercial. I mean,
Perhaps I can help a little bit there. And I think what Ken is using the commercial aspect of is probably more towards the strict side of
and I'm using
interpreting
that
it.
gratuitously too.
Understood. But maybe an example from a recent situation where we had someone claim an agricultural exemption, and then they cleared the lot. And this was brought up at this council for discussion. Well, the lot was cleared, and then we had some discussion. Well, should we be requiring under our zoning ordinance, potentially requiring buffers, even with the agricultural exemption, because there's the potential under our zoning ordinance that you could do so. Well, that is a policy decision. And that's the kind of guidance that I need from this
Write
council.
it up. That would be great.
But
I
that's
would
just
need to
one
s-
aspect
I
of
would
it.
just, if you could brainstorm what they are. I mean, can we brainstorm what they are?
Right, so in
I
the
get
example that
calls a
Steve
lot.
just gave, I think I was the one who brought up the discussion about the buffers. And hearing this presentation tonight and getting, actually, some of the community was aware this was on our agenda tonight, so I fielded a couple of calls today on this topic. And I don't know that I'm prepared to stand with my initial argument about the buffers, or if I need to contemplate a different outcome based on what we heard this evening. If I were to go back to my argument about that particular property and suggest that buffers were appropriate, am I doing a taking? Because if they needed property line to property line to accomplish their agricultural and bona fide agricultural use, and I'm now suggesting that they have to have a 10 or 20-foot undisturbed buffer, I've now encroached on their ability to use their land under our current ordinance. So I could argue at the moment both sides of that, because I don't think we had contemplated the idea of a clear cut in an agricultural use environment under those protections provided by the state, that the homeowner on either side has an argument. That's still to be, I haven't come to that conclusion. I'm still having to consider that.
Well, there are probably a lot of ways that this turns me into a hypocrite. Because if I want to get very conservative on this, my pasture goes right up. I purchased it this way. The fence was on the creek. I mean, it is like right on the creek in most places, and that it's 10 feet away in others. So if we go and we ask other people to do other things, then if that happened to me, in some places, I would not be able to walk horses from in between pastures, because you'd have to, pull it back so far. So again, it would
Yeah, Carol,
problem solution, and I can react to it, but I don't know how else to do that.
so if I comprehend some of the things that Ken shared with us this evening about the bona fide commercial use, and you identify that commercial use to be an equestrian one. If I heard you correctly, some of the stream buffer restrictions that other than for the protection of whatever it was, clean waters, they could potentially clear cut. We have historically protected a stream buffer where you couldn't clear cut to it, provided you didn't disturb the clean water to violate that act. You could clear cut right to the stream. Is that a reasonable interpretation?
There are some prohibitions built further into state law with respect to encroachment into certain bodies of water.
Okay.
But all I can tell you is the statute I went over that specifically said that even with respect to stream bufferings, the agricultural exemption should be considered.
Yeah, that's what I heard you say.
Let me offer a compromise just to think about. And one thing that we could compromise, Councilmember Cookley, being very cognizant of your concerns, is it might be that rather than trying to manipulate the code, think about empowering staff to draft some regulations to help us interpret the code in a consistent way. For instance, what if there was a regulation that said this: in interpreting our various city codes, if the primary use of the property is for commercial agricultural activity, we need say no more. That is exempt. If it's If the primary purpose is not commercial agricultural activity, then perhaps we have a little more of a granular review of how large is the tract of land, what is dedicated to agricultural purposes, and sort of go through like a little bit of a spreadsheet to help staff say, okay, well, in this situation, it is in fact a non-commercial agricultural use, but you know what? It's 11 acres. And 70% of the property is being used for this agricultural activity. And under our little regulation we've adopted, which is attempting to help us consistently interpret this morass of state laws, we're going to allow the exemption in that situation. And we have that not codified, not in a code, it's in a regulation that is used to help staff interpret on a consistent basis.
But Ken, my only issue with that is that's kind of where I think staff still needs to know how broad we want to be with that.
No question.
Because
No question.
in my opinion, I love my 1 acre lot friends. I love my 3 acre lot friends, love my 10 acres. But the people I love the most are the ones that don't sell to developers and can continue to preserve what we love about Milton. And anything we can do to help that, I want to do. So I definitely want to be more broad. But I do think we need to give that direction to staff. So.
Well, I don't
Rick?
like that. Oh, sorry, Rick.
Yeah, we've had a number of things just in the last year. I mean, one of them was somebody cut down trees to make additional pasture for their commercial business where they were going to grow or whatever. And we had a subdivision saying they're burning trees and it's putting ash down in our neighborhood. This has got to be stopped. And the reality is, no, they're running in agriculture. They can do that. That was one instance. The thing that we talked and we had to do some education, kind of like the people who buy right next to a chicken farm or a pig or a dairy farm, and they don't like the smell. They love the view, but they don't like the smell. Well, we don't regulate that. That's actually, that's part of what you bought for that you like. You don't like the smell, but you don't get to exempt yourself from what a farm produces. The issue that when this came forward, because I know I was pretty vocal about this when we brought it up last year, we had an issue where someone said, I'm going to make a pasture for cattle or whatever. And we didn't have a process where they would have to tell us, hey, here's what you're really doing. And they basically said, well, this is a AG use, so you can't tell me what to do. What happened was they changed the topography. They clear cut right over to the 18-acre horse farm next to them. That wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was the erosion and flooding, ultimate flooding of their next door neighbors with filling up what was a dry creek bed that channeled all the water when it did rain. And then it eventually made it down to the stream. It wasn't right next to a stream, but that sediment, I walked the property twice. Now they have flooding on their property. I don't know if we've got the state to help us with this, but that was part of when we started this discussion is, okay, we now recognize this isn't what we want to have happen. Because they also put in, I believe, on that property, they may have changed their drainage and put pipes underground. So they didn't just do a minor clearing. It had additional impact. And that's the challenge is, okay, we know we don't like to see that. And I don't understand, and maybe Ken, you can help us. What's the recourse from a city standpoint and from that property owner their property's been damaged, as well as the state waters have now pollution? I don't think we've resolved that yet. It's something like I said, at this point, I don't want to call, I hesitate to call the property owner back who's been damaged because what can I tell them? What can we do to help them? And then what can we do in the future to not have that unwanted result without encroaching into, somebody's property rights? Because I understand what Scott talked about. We do want to encourage keeping as much of this property clean, that's part of the beauty of Milton. We don't want to see everything, and it's a fine line, but that's where I think what Carol was saying is we need some help. And how do we navigate that so we accomplish the very thing of protection that we want without overreach?
Well, it's very difficult for a government to retroactively enforce, right? It's too late. The damage has already been done. To the extent that there's been some manipulation of the normal course of water off the property, then that's going to be a civil action for nuisance. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that's a satisfactory result. I'm simply
I
saying
hear you.
that's very much the genesis of this discussion is to give staff an understanding of what your expectation is to how this is going to be enforced in the future. So we won't let something go through that we did not handle either.
I think we handled it, just to clarify, I think we handled it within our current statutes.
Right, okay.
So nobody is saying staff didn't do what they should have done. The issue is, how do you not have that consequence happen again? Because now the damage is done. And I guess separate from this meeting, I'd like to just understand, how do we advise that property owner who's got damaged property that we're done, or the state's going to help you with this? That's a separate discussion. So I'm more interested, when this first came up, how do we prevent, that was a live example of what we didn't want to see happen.
It is a separate discussion, but it's not. And this was an agriculturally exempted property, and from the plans, at least that I was aware of, it appeared to be a bona fide agricultural use. And there is a remedy to that, and that is state enforcing the sedimentation laws. They cannot, from a state perspective, you can't put sedimentation into state waters. And from an agricultural exemption standpoint, they're the only ones that can enforce that. We do not have the authority. But to what Ken was saying is, let's say you have some type of erosion and it's affecting your property, but it's not getting to state waters. There's civil remedy for that.
Right.
And that is trespass. Am I saying it correctly? And that I think the two of those combined in that situation may be something for them to be looking at. I don't know what the state did in that situation, but the only thing I do know is that we lack the authority to do something with it. I think I didn't expect to come out of here with answers to every question. I need a starting point. And, let's for argument's sake say we had a spectrum of 1 to 10, 1 being the least restrictive, 10 being the most. Maybe you give me, I don't need a number generally, but that's kind of where I was hoping to end here. So if you came out and said, we want to be the most restrictive possible, we want it to be only commercial operations, I know where to start. I don't think that's where everyone's head is, but at least I know where to start. Right now, I'm not really sure where to start. I don't want to waste time on being very restrictive and then coming in here and completely missing the target. Conversely, I don't want to come in here and being too loose on our regulations so that you're forced as a council to try to draw that in. So I'm doing my best to try to find out where your collective head is on this so we can draft the appropriate regulations.
And just for purposes of I don't want us to mess up our discussion about the terms I'm using. So can we just agree that a broad interpretation would mean that the agricultural exemption is going to be construed broadly to capture just about anything that I feel like can fit within that definition? Okay, that's a broad. A narrow is more of perhaps the commercial and commercial only, and they have to have a bona fide commercial farm operation. And so that's my broad to narrow. And I think what Steve's saying is, I'd like to, even if I can't get exactly where you are, maybe an idea. If Mr. Mayor, I thought I heard you say I'm more toward the
I'll
broad
go ahead and
side.
start. I'm definitely on the broad side. I do like the notification. I do think there should be something that notifies the city that some agricultural use is going to be performed, because I do think staff should be able to take a look at that in case neighbors call, or maybe that might not be a agricultural use exemption, but something, in my opinion, does need to be turned into the city. But I'm definitely more in the broad camp, because let's all be honest. We don't have commercial cattle farms in Milton. We have small hobby farms, someone that owns 5 acres that does, bees and sells honey, or we have someone that does a big garden, or someone that sells tulips, or someone that has a hobby farm that wants to build a pond to, water his stuff. So, I'm definitely more in the more broad camp, but I'd love to hear from council though.
Go ahead.
Shoot, yeah.
And I get that. And I think with the kind of property we have left, it's unlikely that we're going to get a significant commercial entity to come in and want to do business here. It's not the right environment, probably doesn't have the right infrastructure support for that. So it's going to fall into some of the smaller and some of the nuance that's coming to that. And I would tend to fall on the broad side as well, except You guys ticked through 3 out of 4 or 3 out of 5 instances that I wrote down in preparation for tonight that we've experienced in the last couple of years. So it's not that we're without pain points, regardless of scale. It's a horrible situation when a neighbor has to sue a neighbor over a civil case because of land or erosion. That if we had a process where we could engage at some level, to your point, to know what's coming and say, well, gee, a quick review of the topography with a quick review of your plans that you had to prepare for the city, it looks like there could be some water issues, or gee, you're totally destroying the buffer that everybody has enjoyed. And maybe whatever the list is of things that we know if we don't engage, we're likely going to end up with a neighbor having to sue a neighbor. So there should, to Scott's point, there may be some levels of engagement that we could have, whether it's seasonal, whether it's grass types. I'm not going to pretend for a minute to understand any of that stuff, but it makes some sense that the city have a chance to weigh in at some point, which then takes me from that broad interpretation to something right of the middle to say we have to engage at some level.
I think what I'm hearing is we're trying to figure out, when does the city get involved with land disturbance as it relates to agriculture, and at what point do we have a say, or how do we want it to be a say? Because that's really what it comes down to. Someone does a garden and they do a large garden, and I grew up having a half-acre garden, but that wasn't the primary use of the property, and it was for myself, not for commercial use. I may have sold a few vegetables, but most of it was for consumption by my family. I think that, and I guess I'd lean more towards broad in that I do not want to restrict property rights, but I do not, some of the things that the pain that we've had, I think we need to look at, is there a way to alleviate that and cut it off at the pass so we don't have some of the issues that now on the back end, how do we fix it while it's done?
I will say, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, on the issues that we've had, did those people self-engage with their folks and just do what they did because they thought they had the so-called right? Or was there a consultation with the city and then they did what they did? Do we know what happened in any of those cases? Because it's more problematic when you're deciding liberal or more conservative, more broad, et cetera, if you don't know what the process is. Because it's a consultative sale. I mean, to be successful, to be able to get it the way you want, it's the city engaging and saying, hey, these are best practices in Milton. Do we have teeth for these? No, but you can get sued under the Waterway Act and this act and this act. It's a process. Do we have a process where does everyone intersect with the city before something happens?
No, the examples that I can cite for you,
They don't.
there wasn't any interaction with the
Is
city.
there any way that we can create that so that then we can at least have the conversation and have a process so that people don't go off and shoot their 6-shooters on their own?
I think there would be. I think that's one of the beauties of there being this sort of flexibility, is that since we're getting the ability to have the governing authority, the city tell us, if you decide that you want to take a broad view of the exemptions, which I think we have the authority to do for all the reasons that I've sort of walked you all through, but then you want to instill in your code, though, that even if we believe it's a bona fide agricultural use, we still want some degree of BMPs to be applied. I think we could do that.
So can we do it on, for example, the sale of any certain tract of land and above, that there is a consultation with the city? I mean, I'm giving it rough language here. But look, my bottom line is, when you earlier defined the commercial on one side and has all these exemptions, but we don't necessarily have it on the ag side over here. So I have to be blind to both tracks because I don't want households, right? So, and I don't really see the difference between whether you're teaching writing lessons or somebody else is growing hay. I mean, it suits me as a council person up here preserving the land.
But the issues we face though are never sort of made up. I mean, it's real people complaining about real impacts.
I understand
And my
that.
experience has been that governments like yourself that are attempting to set the table to ensure agricultural uses remain in Milton. I get that. I know
Right,
that's your
right.
public policy objective for years. But on the other hand, when those folks that come and it's the hard case, y'all typically want to be able to help them, and we can't, because we've got to be consistent at that point of how we've treated everyone else. You see I'm just trying, I guess
But
what I'm
Ken-
saying is the hard
But
case.
Ken, I
sometimes.
think you're answering it yourself. I mean, we're not going to have these so-called commercial things unless we allow a commercial definition to be giving lessons at her place, selling a horse at my place, selling honey over here. I mean, unless that meets the definition of commercial, then, we're all in just hobby farms. And if we're just in hobby farms, then we're asking for a lot of controls. And yeah, we can do that. But then to Mr. Reese's point, we start scaring off people, we start getting more homes. So it's a consultation process. I mean, the ones that we've had trouble with, it's been about land disturbance, as you've said. And we need to let people know on the front end what's the penalties and consult with them along the way. I mean, I would love to be, if the city were inserted in that, not from a punitive standpoint, not on a narrow, but on a broad, but to be able to have eye-to-eye contact and let them know what the price. Steve's not buying it. But
I don't think those people were going to notify the city.
Mike making faces.
Yeah.
You're so
Let's-
transparent.
grab that
I mean,
mic, man.
I'm
Ready to go.
working it, but he's not
Finger.
buying
I
it.
think I know where we're going. I think we're starting to get some direction for y'all.
Can I come in first? Yes. If you take Carol's point, the word that she used that troubled me was the word punitive. There's a way to engage without it being punitive if it's proactive, because if you establish a point of engagement where you're not necessarily going to say no to what they want to do, but you introduce some of the mitigation things that have historically created the problems, that's not punitive.
Mhm.
That's proactive engagement for the betterment of the outcome.
So the application exists.
Good.
And it identifies certain things that will ahead of time, so that we'll have an understanding of what kind of impact it can be. But to give you an example, on the current application, it asks for what's the commercial aspect of your proposed agricultural exemption. I don't think that's going to be a factor from what I'm hearing here. That would be the most strict interpretation. And I think that helps us tailor that. So we do engage on the front end, and we go through some of what they're looking to do, and we do provide some guidance, some BMPs and things along those lines, so they don't negatively impact the neighbors or the state's waterways or things like that. But to the speaker's point, perhaps we can grow that, no pun intended, and we can better instruct some of the people that are looking to build these hobby farms, because a lot of people that are looking to do these things aren't necessarily from agricultural roots, also no pun intended. They need some guidance, and perhaps we can do, as part of the application process, that can become part of the process. And we talk about silt fencing and the state waterways, and here's what to look out for. And we see the topography of your property, and we can see which way it's sloping. And these are the things you're really going to need to consider. And you might consider a small detention pond while you're doing your work at the bottom, so nothing gets off to your neighbor's property. We can do those kinds of things on the front end, which I think is a great idea. We just so long as we have an understanding of where council wants to be at the end, we can get there.
If the paradigm that we're heading to is, I'm going to call it the broad paradigm, which I completely understand and respect, I would say two things. Number one, first of all, the government doesn't really do a good job of asking nicely for people to do. I'm just trying to be real. I mean, we either have the ability to make you do it by way of our regulatory power, or we don't. But sort of asking nicely is great, and we can do that. But if they ignore us, then we get ignored. And secondly, I will say this: there have been a couple of these situations that have arisen where, if they would have done business with us, they wouldn't have gotten themselves into the mess they got into with them. So I know that there is this notion that having to get these, going through the regulatory land disturbance permit process is bad, because it's all this hassle. And I get it. It is work. On the other hand, though, there are things that we would do when we review your plans with respect to hydrology, with respect to best management practices, that candidly will probably, in some respects, help you from yourself, save you from yourself as well. So just keep that in mind, as my experience has been, that can be very productive for our citizens.
And I'll take a counterpoint to that as far as if I want to do a horse farm, I don't know why I would need to give you a hydrology study. And I think if we remove the commercial on the ag exemption, if we just remove the commercial point, I think it helps the process. But I think what you just said was, I think that's the problems we're kind of getting into now, is that we're forcing these people to go through the LDP process. We're forcing them to do all these hydrology studies, when I think the broad opinion is we want to be more broad. So why would we force them to get all that stuff done? But I think it depends, how big and intense is the use? And I think that's where the gray area is, which I hate to put staff in these positions, to where they're interpreting what council wants. And I think we need to try to give some more direction.
I will speaking for myself. This is perfect, because this is giving me some assistance to guide staff as well.
Yeah.
I always get very concerned when like the statement you just made, where the government's going to help protect you. It just bothers the heck out of me. It's just one more inclusion that I think gets in the way. And I think many times the thought may be right, but it seems to end up that way. It seems to end up more of a problem and more of getting in the way, or a roadblock. And I think we've got to take this as liberal as possible, personally.
On the other hand, we do have people out there that are suing neighbors that are miserable. And so I mean, it's a great discussion
There
to
needs to be
have.
one
I
little
just,
protection there.
yes, there needs to be some way to help staff, and also to keep it from literally approaching on neighbors and becoming a problem. And one small thing, and it probably is part of the consultative sale, but it's sort of old thinking to max a lot, and that's a pasture. That's the worst kind of pasture. The best pasture is with trees. And we need to get that back in, and that would help Milton quite a bit. So it just needs to be part of a new thinking about how we do all this stuff. And so, but I was saying that Mr. Reese's benefit also said that.
Councilmember Jacobus, I typically, when I meet people, I say I'm a government lawyer. I'm here to help.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I'm the government. I'm here to
And I don't
help.
know why.
Wasn't that the
From the government.
Ronald
I'm here to
Reagan?
help.
Well, I think if you give us ideas about staff struggles, like where it gets complicated, and we can brainstorm around that. But I think if we have the power to insert some process, then let's do that.
Mayor, could I ask? Oh, I'm sorry.
So Carol, are you saying that animals like to have shade? They just don't want a totally open
It's an
field where
amazing
they're going to
thing.
graze and overheat
It's
in
an amazing
Georgia's summer?
thing. It's really interesting.
I think that what we're really grappling with is, I think that where we want to have someone involvement is when describe what is the use, what's that property going to be used, and what's the scope or size of the disturbance. If somebody is doing their garden and they want to clear some soil that they have, that I don't want to be involved in that. And to what Mr. Reese's example, he gave a couple of them, livestock breaking through a fence. Okay, that was not deliberate. That stuff will happen if you have livestock. Or cutting a tree. If you have to cut a tree down, do you want to, on 170 acres, do you want to require them to come in to get a permission? I think we're all saying, no, that's not what we're talking about. The challenge is, how do we give you guys enough process that you can actually do something with it, versus saying, just make it right. Don't get people upset.
I feel pretty good about what we received from the feedback we got tonight. Though Bob and Jerry, you guys are on the front lines of this. Is there anything that you want to add to the conversation or any questions you'd like answered?
I'll just tell the council that basically most of the people that come in that want to utilize the agricultural exemption basically just want to come in and divert from any of the laws that the city imposes. They come in and say, I'm agricultural, hands off, you can't do a damn thing. I'm allowed to do what I want to do, and I'm agriculturally exempt. And I want to preserve, as the city community development director, and I've been with the city for a long time too. And one of my big objectives is to preserve all of these large lots, to preserve all these hobby farms, and to keep Milton, Milton. But it's very difficult when a person who buys a piece of property comes in and says, I don't want to have any regulatory control. I'm just going to do what I want to do. That's like walking outside and saying, hey, I could do anything I want to do. I can carry a gun, I can start shooting, I could drink in public, I can do whatever I want to do, and nobody can regulate me. Well, but laws are there to protect the overall public, the health, safety, and welfare. That's what the laws say. That's everything we do. That's my charge, is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the general public at large. And when we have owners come in and just say they can do whatever they want to do, it is very difficult for staff or for the city at large to regulate any control over that person. So I don't think the real conversation is, do we want state law that says you're totally exempt, or do we want some city law? The city laws could be molded to any level of regulatory control. So we could say, okay, you can do an LDP for this particular use, hobby farm, and maybe there's less regulation outlined in it, but you still have to come in and get an LDP with less regulatory control. But there's still some sort of LDP that governs what it is you're looking to do. But when somebody comes in and says, there it is, it's state law, I'm agriculturally exempt, and you can't do anything to control what I'm doing. I'm just going to go out and do what I want to do. I'm not so sure that the council really wants to do that. I think the council wants to preserve hobby farms and to help people do these things. But they don't want to just sit there and say, you're totally exempt. So sometimes I look and say, okay, Ken is saying, if it's commercial, well, okay, maybe if it's bona fide commercial and it is restrictive, well, then that's going to force people to go back to the LDP process. That's all it's going to do. We're going to say, okay, you have to preserve 20% of your trees as your tree canopy. You have to implement some silt fence, and you can't cut down trees in a buffer. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to see buffers just wiped out. I mean, they're basically coming in saying, I am totally exempt. And that's what they come in and tell me. They come in and they sit down and say, we are state regulated agriculture, and we are totally exempt from any of your regulation. So instead of trying to manipulate the state, we could just say the state regulation is commercial. It is. And that's very, very restrictive. Now, government make some rules for these hobby farms with the LDP process that we could look at that will assist those folks, just like we did incentivizing large lots. We could do the same thing. We can incentivize hobby farms in the LDP process and just make the laws a little less for those particular, but it gears itself on intensity. Somebody has a quarter of an acre, and when they just want to do a little pumpkin patch versus somebody who's got 10 acres or 50 acres, we can regulate that separately through the LDP process and just make it like LDP light or graduate the LDP process. I mean, there's different ways we could do it, but to say, okay, we're just going to let you come in and fall under the state regulation, well, that's exempting you from everything. It's literally like walking out there and I tell a police officer, hands off, you can't touch me because I'm agriculture and you can't do anything. I can do anything I want to do. I could spin on your property, I could throw trash in your property, I could drive as fast as I want to do, and there's no regulation. That's kind of a dangerous place for Milton to be in. And we have a lot of people that come in, and that's why we have a lot of folks complaining and saying there's no regulations. And then Steve looks at me and says, it's hands off. You can't touch them. Let them do whatever they want to do. And that's just a hard place for Milton to be. So I just want to kind of give you the other rationale, because I'm on the front lines and I'm seeing it. I'm not saying we shouldn't totally hit them with the same LDP process that we do when they're doing a subdivision. Maybe we do an LDP process that's geared more towards hobby farms. Why do we have to have just one LDP process? Maybe we have something a little lighter that can encourage those, just like we do at large lots. And we come in with some sort of formula, but it's not a state formula where you're totally exempt.
Well, I
So that's
understand
it.
what you're saying. You're talking about tethering to the city. And again, if you know what the problems are as you see them. If you could give problem, potential solution,
Yep.
problem, potential solution,
I like that.
I can react to that. I don't know how to do it otherwise.
But, and the applicants are still forced to come in and still make an application and still go through some sort of regulatory review. Because if they deviate from some of those guidelines, we have code enforcement mechanisms where we can go out and shut them down. I was on a project today, there's dust flying all over the place, it's dry, there's dust, I mean, it's just everywhere. We told them, look, either you get a water truck out here and you regulate the dust control, or I'm gonna put a stop work on, I'm gonna shut you. Now, with that kind of regulatory arm, within 3 hours, they had a water truck out there and they were spraying it all and they were controlling the dust. Without any regulatory arm, there's nothing I can do. You call me up and say, Bob, is there anything you can do to help these neighbors? There's water flowing, there's trees being cut down, they're burning them. It's just doing it totally haphazardly. At least with some regulation, I could say, look, if you don't conform, maybe they only burn during certain times of the year that the fire marshal says you can burn, which we have burn ordinances. But if you just let them do it whenever they want to do it, then there's nothing, absolutely nothing that you can do as a council to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the folks that live in Milton, the community at large. So just keep that.
I don't agree with that.
So Mayor, just as a city manager here, I'm hearing a little bit of a disconnect between what I thought the council was saying and what I hear Bob saying. So maybe we can see if we can come together. I'd like some feedback, because what I'm hearing Bob saying is that we may be able to find some middle ground, require some more regulation, maybe some type of LDP that doesn't require the same level of.
I don't think you should call it LDP. Just anytime someone hears the word LDP, that's like, I have a stroke. You know what I mean? So I kind of see where they're coming from. I think they see where we're coming from, and maybe there's a middle ground there. But I know Jan wanted to say something.
Yeah, I don't agree with Bob's position personally. I think some people come in and say that because they're frustrated with having to deal with government. And I think I hear all negative. To me, it's like, how do we watch this person? How do we control them? How do we do this? Instead of letting them do the rights that they have to do. To me, it's too much control. It's like we want to control everything. And I don't think you can control everything. You have to trust that these people are going to protect the land. It didn't get as good as it is right now because government was all on top of them. It got this way because it was not as controlled. And now we're just going to clamp all down on it. I don't agree with it.
No, I think there's been a lot of control that's kept it this way. I understand what you're saying, but again, I'm not in your shoes, and I'm not a regulatory type person. I'm open-minded, but I can also, I want to see what you have what the problems are and what you think the solutions are, and then we can be broad and general on specific things. We can be liberal or conservative on specific things. But if we have a collective vision of what Milton is, and we have decided that with the tree canopy and view sheds and green space, et cetera, then we are very much in a protective mode. So I'm not opposed to being protective, but my innate being is to lean towards this way. But again, I have to react to something. I just can't dream up what it is on something specific that, whether it would be helpful. I mean, do you know what those things are? I mean, what would you articulate that is the most helpful thing that we could do? And we could see where we want to be on that
I
spectrum.
think once the council looked at me and said, Bob, we want large lots, but we don't want to do a taking. How do we achieve that? We said, all right, we'll incentivize large lots. So we came up and the council approved a whole bunch of incentives that basically relaxed a lot of the regulation if you do the 3-acre lot. That's really what we did. And the 1-acre lot has a lot of regulation to it and a lot of time in the process. So we cut down the time. We expedited the process of a review. Maybe we do the same thing here. We say, look, if you want to do a hobby farm and you want to have horse farm or something, that's fine. Let's cut down on the process time. We won't call it an LDP. We'll call it a different, maybe we'll call it a hobby farm rule. And we say, okay, if you want to do a hobby farm, we'll cut it down. We can reduce the regulation. We can say it's graduated. If you have a 1/4 acre, hey, you know, how much am I really going to help you? If you have 5 acres or 10 acres and you want to do more farming, maybe we can help you even more. So there's a way we can sit down and work with Scott. We kind of go through it and say, okay, how do we come up with some light oversight?
It almost sounds, and I hate to disagree with you, Bob, but
Yeah.
I almost feel like that might be creating more regulation. And that I think there's a way to thread this needle without having to do all of that. But that's just,
All right.
that's just my
What
opinion.
is it?
It's not creating another hobby farm LDP that we don't have right now. I think that would actually be more narrow than what we currently have. But that's just my
Well,
opinion.
are we trying to solve it
No, I
tonight?
think-
We're not solving it tonight.
Okay.
I know.
Excuse me.
I mean, it's been a great discussion, but
Shoot, Rick. Go.
I'm probably the lightning rod because I'm the one who's been dealing with this. And I think we're really, from our perspective, is we need direction. Because I can tell you right now, when I went to talk to that lady on Henderson Road and basically sat there and said, you know, we closed him down, but when she says, what are you going to do about this? And we're going to say, we're going to get the state involved. There could have been things we could have done, but we dealt with a homeowner there who just, I'm farm exempt. You had your time. And so we're doing on that one. The other one we're dealing with is basically the farm pond that we just dealt with. We reacted to that. We got some neighbors complained about trees coming down, and you know how trees, and it was in the buffer, well, then you're going to get the arborist and myself out there. And we went out there and stopped them because we had no documentation of what they were doing. And the big thing there was if you could at least submit it to us and not ask for an LDP, but make an application so we can tell people what's going on. You know, every time we deal with staff, we're dealing with things people, I can't tell you how many times we're reporting to people about drainage on each, water's coming on our property, and we got to go back and say that's a private matter. And we don't like to do that. We like to come up with solutions to folks. We just don't like to palm it off and say, well, we're the government, it's your own fault. So that's where we're really looking for it. I know we're not going to be doing poultry or things like that, but we do need some kind of, on a bowling alley, where are the gutters, so we can keep that ball in there. So you can at least give us, as the folks out there, what's good and what's not. So
I think maybe Steve and Ken have an idea. I think we're trying to talk solution, and we're not going to come up with solutions tonight. I don't have it. I don't know. But I think we understand the dilemma you've been, at least I do. And the challenge is, okay, take what you've heard, Steve, and can you come back with something different? I don't think we don't know what it is we want to see until you give us options that will help you and accomplish what we're all trying to talk about. That's kind of what I'm boiling down to this, because I understand the frustration. I understand how some neighbors have been impacted. So the question is, what can we do that's somewhere in the middle that still doesn't restrict property rights?
well, gentlemen, that was very well presented, much better than Ken's presentation.
And it was cheaper than Ken's presentation.
I do want to say Ken and I have been talking a lot about this. And,
Well, I
you know,
understood you. I'm gonna have bad dreams
Oh,
tonight.
well, that's a compliment.
You did your job.
But I feel like I can take the bar now. I'm good.
So, do y'all have some, I mean, a little better idea than we did going in of where we're going with this?
I do. I think,
Just a little bit, right?
I think Bob and I probably have to sit down and maybe redigest this meeting and talk about the kind of the direction that we believe the council will draft something up, just some basic stuff, bring it back here, maybe identify some of those pain points that Councilmember Quickly was talking about and see if we can't maybe refine the direction a little bit.
I appreciate it because, the same pain points staff has, I have, something happens, Jerry gets called, then I get a call, then I call Steve, and it's like, you know what? Let's just fix this problem we got going on. So we want to give you all the best direction possible. So I think we're good.
Can I offer one more?
Yeah, shoot.
One more suggestion?
Yep.
Scott made a very impassioned presentation to us this evening and had some important points for us to consider. In the course of our discussion, I saw a visceral response from him this evening, shaking his head negatively and positively based on the way our conversation went. If there's a chance to re-engage Scott in the defining process between now and the next time you guys come before us, I would encourage you to reach out to Scott.
I'm confident there will be that opportunity.
Be instigated by Scott.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
Thanks.
Are we good, Steve? Anything else?
I appreciate it. That was not an easy thing to get through. So
Okay.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. So